So speaking of the outdoors, I've got talking to a couple of people this morning. I've done a pre-recorded interview over the weekend, and we're talking about Brumbies this morning. Always controversial issue. Strong opinions on all sides of the equation when it comes to Brumbies. And I thought I'd give you the perspective of a high country man by the name of Richard Swain, who runs Snowy River rafting adventures and has also worked for a long time as an Indigenous guide in the Kosciuszko National Park. So I'd like to play this interview with Richard Swain. Started off just by asking him how well he knew or knows the high country. Here he is.
I was born in Cooma because my father was the head field tech for the soil conservation. And what he was doing in the late 60s and into the late 70s was the restoration of the main range. And they were restoring the damage done after the grazing era, the damage done by stock and stockmen.
Yep. Okay. Look, I've been to Calumet Flat just recently in November, actually, and there were 3 dead Brumbies, a lot of damage to the upper waterways. It struck me that the Brumbies are doing a fair bit of damage, and they seem to be everywhere. What's your feeling about the Brumby situation? Are there too many Brumbies in the Snowy Mountains?
Yeah, I'd like to see none. We're getting down to the last of the Australian species now. We've got the highest mammalian extinction rate in the world, and we chose to make that national park a national park, and now we're choosing to overrun it with feral animals. And there has always been the myth of the Brumby and the myth of the stockman, and it's the difference between fact and fiction. There is no benefit in having a feral horse day after day just damaging our native ecosystems just for people's emotional benefits.
Yep. So what sort of damage are you seeing up in the high country, Richard?
Well, it's nearly all waterway damage. So at the moment we're having a good year, so the feral horses are out a bit. They're off. They don't need to be congregating so much on the waterways in the springs because they're thick.
Yep.
But in the drier years, they just congregate towards all the springs, the bogs and the fens, all the the real heritage of the mountains, the water. And so the horses just pug and muddy up everything. The start of the Murray is an absolute disgrace. It's like the gully at the back of the stables at Randwick. It is a disgrace. I think most Australians would believe it was being protected, being in a national park, but it's far from that.
Yep. Yeah, we just saw horses, Brumbies, wild horses, everywhere up in the high country. It really amazed me how many Brumbies there are in the high country. They're by far the dominant animal in the Kosciuszko National Park, I would say.
Definitely. So it's probably 100 kilometres where the Snowy River gets along through the southern part of the park, and they are definitely the most dominant animal in there.
Yeah.
The deer are building up, but they're currently aerial shooting the deer, and the horses they just wreak havoc along there. You hardly see native animals now, and the science says that the scat counts from the late 80s through to 2018 showed exactly that the horses are the largest consumer of that environment.
Yeah. The other thing that really struck me up in the high country, Richard, is that those upper reaches of the Snowy and the upper Murray, in the wet, we were walking through that country in a very wet season. It's like an enormous sponge absorbing and holding water, and with all the sphagnum mosses holding enormous amounts of water that is then released during the dry. And my understanding is that the Brumbies do a lot of damage to that sphagnum moss. Is that your sense?
Oh, it's exactly what they do. To be to be historically correct, the grazing era permanently destroyed at least a third of the mountain's water holding capacity in the sphagnum bogs and springs, etc.
Yeah.
Because they physically drain them with pick and shovel, and the horse, the cattle and sheep, etc. Well, it's like putting machinery on country. Once they create their trenches and they pug and destroy everything, well, that's it. It's no longer habitat or pristine water catchment anymore.
And that must have huge ramifications for the Snowy and the Murray River in the dry, I would think.
Oh, well, the Murray, before the 03 fires, if you got a bit of rain in that Murray catchment, we could raft it for, a week or 2 or 3.
Yep.
Nowadays, if it rains, it sort of gets away within 3 days. And I think the catchment's that hard because after the fires, it never really was allowed to recover because it was completely overrun with hard hooves and it's compacted everything.
Yep.
And all our native species, they live in that thick bush, and they need what's called the subnivean space. They need the snow to not land hard on the ground. They need the snow to land on top of that thick bush, and they can live underneath it through all those bushes. A lot of our native animals don't tunnel. Their tunnels are that thick vegetation.
Yep.
So the broad-toothed rat and the alpine she-oak skinks and all of them, once you've turned it into a horse paddock, well, that's it. They go extinct from that particular area, and those areas are getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, yeah. I tell you, we saw Brumbies everywhere. It's amazing how tough these animals are. Right up the top of the Cobberas, we saw horse manure in the most inaccessible, wild, inhospitable places you could imagine. They get everywhere.
And all you hear is that from the horse supporters is it's the pigs and the deer doing it, but anyone who actually goes and has a look can pretty much see what's doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw some damage from pigs. No doubt they do some damage. Didn't see any deers up there, but I know they're there. But gee whiz, the horses are just trampling everything. The
pigs and the deer have effective management control programs. More effective if people wanted to save what's left of Australia and wanted feral animal control, because we know that's what's sending our native animals extinct, the lack of habitat.
Yeah.
So the horses are, it's a disaster for that country.
What about this, the graziers and the pro-Brumby people saying that grazing reduces blazes? What do you think about that? Has that got any substance to it?
Absolutely none. The science doesn't support that at all. And the reality, so the 3 largest fires of the last 200 years were 1939, 2003 and 2019. Now in 1939, it was full of thousands and thousands of stock. We were still in the grazing era. And so it didn't stop it then. And the grazing actually caused the blazing, because like places like the Bayadbo in 03 that got burnt really badly. During 1830 and 1870, it was the hard hooves and the hot colonial fires that stripped a foot of soil from that entire environment. And so the lower Snowy, which almost looks like Afghanistan now, was described by Townsend as dark chocolatey soil, and the area was rich with fat cattle, and it was a woody grassland. And that no longer. So what we have there now is a matchstick forest. And so once you've stripped the area of its soil by stock and bad management, then the country has to scrubs up. That's its own self-defense mechanism, to scrub up and then spend another century or 3 or 4 trying to rebuild a humus layer and get back to somewhere near where it was.
Yeah.
The grazing era created the blazing era.
And you probably know this as well as anyone, Richard, but when we stopped cattle grazing in the high country, how quickly does that country recover, or does it recover, or is it permanently scarred?
So the main range, most people today wouldn't have a clue what went on up there, but because my father was the head field tech there, I know and have all the old photos. So the main range was some really solid science where they used benign non-native grasses, superphosphate, and they sprayed it out with the hydroseeder. So they mixed bituminous hay and the seedlings together, and they sprayed it all over the bald patches, and they tried to arrest the erosion through all the creeks and gullies. They did an amazing job. It was $26 million, and my father was up there for 12 years every summer trying to do that, or more, I think. And places like the Bayadbo, the plots that were put in there in the 1980s show that the recovery is extremely slow. Yep. So to continually punish it with hard hooves is just a nightmare for country. Yeah. I don't know what sort of words really describe just what a disaster it is. Yeah. The largest grazer, so for 1 million years, the biggest grazer of the mountains is insects. That'll give you an idea of what the difference between insects and hard-hoofed animals, how that country evolved as to what we've done to it.
Yeah. It would seem to me that the horses are doing as much damage as the cattle were in the high country.
We've definitely gone back to that era. And so those people gave up their leases when we decided it should be a national park, and a lot of those people graciously gave up those leases, and so this is a real kick in the face for them that we now are just with another hard-hoofed animal.
Yes.
Because a lot of the leases were that run down, and because the country just didn't last. So it was some leases were still in good nick, but most of them weren't. And all the lower snowy country was a complete mess. So, a lot of the leases were given up graciously, and, it is a kick in the face to those people from that era that now we're redoing it just for people's emotional well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think, like if you were in charge of Kosciuszko National Park, Richard, what would be the best thing to do when it came to wild horses, do you think?
Oh, well, I'd follow the science and the people who created the issue. So the ethics committees, the RSPCA and the best science all believe aerial culling is the most efficient and effective way to get rid of it. In the last 30 years, we've lost 50% of small mammals in the Northern Territory, and it's due to herbivore grazing and feral herbivore grazing, whether that be buffalo or camel or donkey or horse or whatever it may be.
Yep.
We are going, the next 10 years are critical to extinction rates within Australia, and our culture at the moment is to not own the very landscape we live upon, and it's to try and dominate it with colonial myths and myth food. Yep. So we need to really give ourselves a shake and say, okay, we need to do this. We need to aerially cull a lot of feral animals.
Yep.
And those feral animals took the resources from the land they're going to fall on. They actually need to rot back into the soil where they came from.
Yeah.
And it's only cruel because we've let it get this far. We should never have let it happen. And it's our own fault. And at some point we either lose species and end up with only half a dozen species, or we take the responsibility of what it means to be a custodian of the landscape and look after our fellow native species.
And I suppose the longer we ignore that responsibility, the crueler we're eventually going to have to become by killing more horses.
Well, when John Barilaro started playing politics with this, he only had to get rid of 3,000. And between the fires and the drought, there was estimates are 8,000 died. And now 14, so he's got to shoot at least 11,000, and then they grow 20% a year. So that he obviously doesn't like horses and doesn't care about the numbers, because if the numbers mattered, he would have just done it originally. He would have stuck with the original plan.
Yeah. It's interesting in the ACT that they're aerially culling Brumbies.
Well, the ACT, when Scrivener designed the ACT, designed the border around their water catchment. And the ACT government are solid custodians when it comes to their water catchment in their country, and I admire them for that.
Yeah.
I think that's the way it should be. They're taking the responsibility of the custodians very seriously. And their spring, if you walk the Australia, you would have seen Giannini Springs, and it's immaculate.
Absolutely, yeah. We didn't see a single horse until we crossed the New South Wales ACT border.
Yeah.
And as soon as we crossed the border, I reckon there would have been a pile of Brumby manure every 10 or 20 feet.
The people that support the horse, they're not offering any solutions. They don't care about our native species. They only care about the horse. I just think we've got to do the right thing by country and do the right thing by future generations. We can't. It's unsustainable. We all know that. I don't think any of these horse people could take you up there and show you the square millimetre where the horse is good for country, show you the square millimetre where the grazing area is good for country. It doesn't exist. It's all myth. It's all untrue. And it's the sad reality is we're going to send things extinct and we're going to destroy that country.
Yep. Richard, thanks for your time.
Dr Ben Keaney from the ANU. I'm also a wetland wetland consultant that has been assessing wetlands in Kosciuszko National Park.
Great, fantastic. Now, Richard made a couple of really good points. One of which was you were talking about the heritage value of the horses and the sort of sentimental heritage value of that, but he regards the real heritage of the Snowy Mountains as its water, as a storage and source of the Snowy and the Murray, and you know the real importance of water, and a much more culturally and from a heritage point of view far more important than the Brumbies. And so I'd be very interested to talk to you about, you know, the impact of the Brumbies on the high country in the Snowy Mountains, Kosciuszko National Park, particularly on the waterways and their impact on streams. What's your perspective on that?
Oh, look, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that the impact of horses, and especially the large numbers of horses that we're seeing in Kosciuszko National Park at the moment, is having a detrimental effect on the water quality and other hydrological features in Kosciuszko National Park. If we go if we think even from the start, from where the water begins, so stuff like bogs and say swamps. Horses running through that can really degrade those ecosystems. And that's sort of a two-pronged thing. That's not only physically in terms of the hydrology, so putting in creek lines or draining these sort of peatlands. The other thing is by draining those peatlands, then they actually threaten the community of the peatlands, either through the peat drying out, through making the peatland more flammable, to possibly trampling wildlife, and just generally, being a real terror to those sort of peatlands that are the source of the water. Then, if we think about once the water starts to go down a bit, the creek lines, there's more than enough evidence that horses impact creek lines by collapsing the banks, by muddying the waters, and just generally reducing the water quality. And that's from not only impacting the waterway itself, but stuff like horse manure can impact the water quality as well. It is very, very plain that large numbers of horses, and especially the huge numbers of horses that we're seeing at the moment, which has been a result of New South Wales government inability to actually manage the horse population, that's what we're seeing.
Yep. And tell me about sphagnum moss. How do the wild horses affect the moss?
Oh, okay. So in terms of say the water that in Kosciuszko National Park, a lot of it is comes from streams, and these streams will, or even groundwater will run into these things called bogs. Now,
yep.
The definition of a bog is a sort of raised area of these hummocks of moss. The hummocks are sphagnum moss.
Yep.
What we see is when the horses are in the area, and especially large numbers of horses in the area, is that they'll run through these hummocks, and by doing that, they'll make tracks. Now, the problem with that is those tracks eventually can form drainage lines. And the difficulty is that instead of the water staying on site, which is key for these bogs to survive, is that the water will run through these drainage lines and then flowing down into other creeks. And then what we look at is that, as I said previously, either the bog can dry out, be more flammable, or it can just turn into a grassland. So what you can see in some areas, and I was looking up a few months ago in areas up near Long Plain, so in the northern section of Kosciuszko, where you can see a horse track, and on the above it there would say be a sphagnum bog, and below it would be a grassland. So you can see that's the actual point where the drainage has, the water no longer goes down the slope. It's collected into that drainage line and zoots off into the creek. So that's generally how I describe their impact in terms of sphagnum bogs.
Mm-hmm. And what about the ability of a bog to recover? Like, if we got rid of the Brumbies, do these bogs actually recover, or was the damage they're causing permanent?
Oh, no, they can recover. I mean, it is possible to actually rehabilitate bogs. So at the moment, we're looking at some rehabilitation of bogs following the 2020 fires in Kosciuszko.
Yep.
So it is possible to rehabilitate them, but it's quite a slow process. So on one hand, say you could re-wet the peat, so impede the drainage line, so you're getting water to stay in the bog or the mire a little bit longer. But then what's got to happen is you still have to have the re-establishment of those vegetation communities. And say something like moss, you can imagine, it does take several years to grow, and decades and things. So to come back to its previous level does take a long time. Now, if we add to that the predictions for global climate change, and we're looking at an increased number of fires, that between those two threads, I mean, we're really looking at some difficulties with maintain, about the sustainability of bogs.
Yeah. So bogs getting drained, less sphagnum, and hotter, drier summers is going to put a lot of pressure on Kosciuszko National Park. Absolutely,
but the other point with this is also fires, frequency of fires. So, and we've noted that what we're looking at least in some of the northern sections of Kosciuszko, and we also see it in the Magic National Park in the ACTs, we're getting a fire recurrence interval of about, you're looking about every 20 years. And under those circumstances, it is impossible for the bogs to fully recover. Then we add to that community in crisis, and a population of horses that isn't managed, suitably managed. Then we're really looking at a very, very big strain on that ecological community. Now, in of itself, that is problematic. But when we consider that Kosciuszko itself is effectively the source 80% of the water that goes into the Murray-Darling Basin, this has ramifications not only ecologically, but also when we think about it, it has ramifications socially for Australia itself.
Yeah. So you've touched on fire risk, both from the drying out of bogs and from climate change. One of the popular arguments used by pro-Brumby supporters is that grazing reduces blazing. Is there any substance to that from a scientific point of view?
Oh, look, I really don't think so. I mean, if say what we look at is the main problem with the main sources of combustion in at least in the recent fires, is it's fine fuel. So you're looking at say small sticks and leaves and things like that, and Brumbies and cattle really don't have a big impact on that. If we're looking at say the impact of Brumbies on the wetlands themselves, and we think about the impact that they have in terms of draining and drying out these wetlands, then we actually see the exact opposite. So we end up seeing a landscape that becomes more flammable, and it's more flammable because moisture which was in the system is not in the system as long. So it gets into the drainage channels and which were created by the horses or the cattle in these wetlands areas, and you're seeing an actual more flammable environment there. So and that's it. And then, as I say, the other thing is if we consider a 40-degree day with 100-kilometre-hour winds, it's difficult. Having a bunch of horses or cattle isn't really going to stop a fire that under those conditions. So, just even in terms of the basic fire science, it is very questionable in extreme fire conditions.
Yeah. There's another really interesting point that Richard Swain made, and that is that failing to control Brumby numbers is a real kick in the guts for the cattlemen who had their high country leases withdrawn because of damage done to the high country by cattle. And now we're seeing just as much or even more damage done by the Brumbies than was done by cattle. I mean, are Brumbies as bad as cattle in the high country?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think they have a very similar impact. I mean, I think one of the things about the pro-Brumby lobby is that they might question the number of Brumbies that are in Kosciuszko, but I think it's pretty plain that that whether it's a cattle or it's a horse, that very large animals with hard hooves really do impact on the wetlands of Kosciuszko. I mean, these areas are sensitive areas. If you're putting hundreds of head of cattle in a wetland, it's obviously going to have an impact in terms of soil compaction, in terms of the actual drainage, in terms of the hydrology. I mean, it's quite obvious that that's going to be the case. Yeah.
So what do you think, can Kosciuszko National Park maintain in a sustainable way any population of Brumbies? Is there a number that you'd be happy with that would do minimal damage up in Kosciuszko National Park?
Look, I mean, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? I think that where we stand at the moment, I think that we need to have a large reduction of horses in the park. Now, I don't necessarily see horses being eradicated in the park at this stage as an option. Even though I know individuals that would prefer it, and personally, I might think that might be a good thing. But realistically speaking, I just don't see that that's going to be the case. Yeah. What we might be able to see is that say for instance you could have Brumbies, but in the future, but Brumbies might only be on private property. So that's a solution where we could have Brumbies as well, and then Brumbies not impacting a national park. So one of the important things about the national park is that its sort of natural values and natural qualities are maintained. And with the current numbers, that's not occurring. If we see a reduction to, I've heard numbers of 600, 1,000, or whatever bandied about. That might reduce the amount of damage that they're doing. But again, in terms of the Brumbies itself and a long-term management plan, I think one way to do it would be having Brumbies on in terms of private leases or something like that, or perhaps a state forest to have it hitched to an actual national park. I just think it's problematic.